So with everything going on with the Ukraine and Russia situation, I came across a video, an older video of Noam Chomsky, basically in one way or another predicting the future, although not really. But what he does in this video is, of course, what he usually does is speak brilliance and truth to power. But he talks about NATO, Russia, Ukraine, and what he says here is a sentiment that has quite literally, if not largely, been left out of the mainstream discourse, what you're seeing on especially US media, and you're being fed something entirely different than how all of this actually transpired. Take a look at this clip of Noam Chomsky talking about this, and then I want to talk about it myself.
The question that we ought to be asking ourselves is, why did NATO even exist after 1990? Throughout the whole history of the Cold War, we were told NATO is necessary to defend Western Europe from the Russian hordes, okay? No more Russian hordes. What happens to NATO? It expands, okay? It expands to the east. Its mission changed. Its official mission now is not to defend Europe from the Russian hordes. It's to control the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines, and to serve as a US-run intervention force. Well, you know, we're all educated intellectuals. We can now ask a question. What was the nature of the propaganda we were fed all those years? I mean, if NATO was there to defend the West from the Russians, why is it now expanding right to the borders of Russia, becoming a global US intervention force, protecting sea lanes and pipelines and so on? What that tells us is all the talk about the Cold War was just a pure lie. And there's plenty more evidence for that, which we could go into. Educated intellectuals don't pursue this line of thought, but it's a pretty obvious one. Well, going on to Ukraine, Mearsheimer's point is that for any Russian leader, whoever it might be, you know, Mahatma Gandhi, Ukraine is right at the core of their geostrategic concerns. For Ukraine to be taken into NATO, which is what is repeatedly threatened, would be a very serious threat to Russian security, quite apart from historical interests, which go way back, the origins of the Russian Empire, in fact. So yeah, you can give arguments against Russian interference in eastern Ukraine after the coup that took place there, but it's a complicated story, and the West is not without its significant initiatives there.
Wow, that is something that you aren't going to hear on mainstream media. That question isn't being raised. You know, these questions aren't being asked. These subjects aren't being discussed. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out why. Now, with that being said, as Noam alluded to towards the end of that clip, look, there's a long and kind of confusing history of Ukraine. In 2014, they were the victim of a coup that was indeed backed by the U.S. We've played our own hand in their internal affairs. They endured a civil war. It's a long and complicated history that I don't want to get into. But I do want to talk about what he discussed in that video. The question we ought to be asking ourselves, Noam says, is why did NATO even exist after 1990? If NATO was to stop communism, why is it now expanding towards Russia? And that's a question that isn't being asked. And if you think back, George H.W. Bush, George Sr., he actually said to Mikhail Gorbachev, I believe his name was, that NATO wouldn't expand toward Russian borders, if I got that correctly. And it's been these nominal promises from the West, from the US, that NATO would not further expand towards Russia, as they would view that indeed as an act of aggression. Obviously, looking at the events that have transpired leading up to today, they have. But they kept expanding, and you ask yourself why, and Noam talks about it there. And it really puts into perspective how we've gotten into this situation. But you know what? My eyebrow was raised from the very beginning. Why? Because the U.S. has, and look, first of all, let me state, what Putin has done is absolutely illegal. This is illegal under international law. He shouldn't have done it. You can't invade sovereign countries like Ukraine, and he needs to leave immediately. If I haven't said that already, there it is. His actions, the actions of the Russian military, most importantly, deserve to be condemned. But with that being said, before that even occurred, we saw the troop build up along Ukraine's border. You kind of knew something was going to happen eventually. And we learned that there were these negotiations that were going on. And I don't have it in front of me, so I can't really give you the specifics. My apologies. But each side had their own kind of gripes and grievances and what they were asking for. And I'm going to paraphrase here, but what Putin basically wanted was, okay, I don't want Ukraine to join NATO, point number one. I don't want missiles pointed at my country, point number two. And he asked for maybe one or two other things. But as far as I can recollect, his asks were very, very reasonable, it seemed to be. But the U.S. looked at it as a non-starter. I think they actually said from the Biden administration, it may have been Antony Blinken or whoever, said that not allowing Ukraine to join NATO was a non-starter. And so negotiations were botched from the beginning, as far as I can understand it. And what I'm having trouble coming to terms with is that that was basically over the principle of Ukraine joining NATO. Now, Ukraine, at this point, they can't join NATO. Even before then, the road to joining NATO is incredibly difficult, given everything that we know. It's incredibly obvious. But it's over the principle of, well, maybe they can. No, they should be able to. A reasonable person would look at something like that and go, that's insane. That's absolutely insane. It makes absolutely no sense. And Vladimir Putin, one could say, well, maybe he would have invaded anyway. Maybe this, maybe that. You don't know. You don't know if the decision was never made. And needless to say, that decision isn't too late to make. And that's something that I may elaborate on in a separate video or further along in this one. But what I want to talk about now is, look, Ukraine's president is quite literally a joke. He's a former actor / comedian. And what he has been doing, I'll give you my personal opinion. That's what I do on this channel. I don't really like his rhetoric. I haven't really been fond of the things that he's been saying, because his thing, and this is what I've been seeing coming from him, is we need to stand tall, us Ukrainians, and stand up to the Russian military and Vladimir Putin and all this other stuff. And we need the U.S. and NATO and their allies to stand with us with their sanctions. And we'll get into those sanctions in a minute. When you should actually be trying to figure out how to bring an end to this through peaceful means as quickly as possible. The U.S. should come out immediately and say, okay, look, NATO is not going to accept Ukraine. Ukraine will never be in NATO. Look at rolling back some of the people that are in NATO, for God's sake. Do whatever you got to do. How difficult is this really? But when you're dealing with big egos and people that are insanely corrupt, like all the leaders that lead these countries, well, then this is what the hell you get. This is what you get. And the U.S. and Europe and all of this has just been a complete embarrassment. What Obama did back when Putin essentially annexed Crimea, which is what he did, they essentially looked at it and were like, we don't really care. Now, they sanctioned Russia, as Biden is sanctioning now these tough sanctions that in the grand scheme of things aren't going to amount to anything. If anything, it's going to hurt the people here at home, Americans, more so than anybody else. Need I remind you, we're dealing with an inflation. I've heard people in California are already at $5 at the pump. That's going to increase. It's absolutely insane. And you have to ask yourself the question, is all of this even worth it? But I kind of pivoted for a second, but I want to pivot back. I actually liked Obama's approach because, in a sense, it was the most reasonable because it's an area of the world that doesn't matter that much to you. Why spend the energy on it? Why spend the resources? Joe Biden issued a statement saying that there will be no American soldiers taking part in whatever is going on in Ukraine. Then what's with all this posturing and these sanctions and all this ridiculousness? Why? I mean, it's like you're saying a bunch of stuff, but you're not doing anything. You know, I mean, it seems kind of clear cut. Either you have boots on the ground invasion, which is a no-go for the U.S., or you sit back and you do what you can through diplomacy, which is effectively doing nothing, but also issuing statements like NATO will never accept, Ukraine will never be a part of NATO. Please withdraw your troops and issue securities so that these people may feel satiated in some sense or satisfied. But that isn't happening. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. It could happen. But in worst case scenario, this can, of course, escalate to what many people online are joking about, which is another world war, which is in no sense a joke. But this is the new age of social media, and the jokes are going to come regardless. But, I mean, the antics, I just truly can't really seem to wrap my head around. That seems to be a sentiment that's shared amongst pretty much everyone. I don't understand why do so much, chest puffing out and head held really high to ultimately do nothing. I mean, you got to think Vladimir Putin knew sanctions were going to come, whether he did this or not. He did this back when he jacked Crimea. The sanctions came. He didn't leave Crimea. He didn't change up his ways. He had to know the sanctions were going to come before he even went into Ukraine. That didn't deter him from doing it. And they're not leaving now that these sanctions are being announced. So what are these sanctions really supposed to do? And let me tell you how unserious these sanctions are now that I just thought about it. So Britain announced sanctions, and I want to make sure I get this guy's name right. And I actually learned this from watching Matt Taibbi, a person that's really familiar with Russia and this entire history on the situation. So Britain, they sanctioned like 3 people or so. But a person that they refused to sanction was a man by the name of Roman Abramovich, or I'm butchering his name, Roman Abramovich, or however you say his name. He's a Russian oligarch, but they're not sanctioning him because he owns the Chelsea football team, and that would be an inconvenience to Britain. That's how unserious these fucking sanctions are. These sanctions, you got to realize, Trump with his sanctions / tariffs on China. China's doing amazing economically. We've been sanctioning Russia out of the wazoo. They seem to be doing just fine. I mean, it's a lame game, and it seems to me like our leaders care more so about anything else other than what goes on domestically. And that is kind of what this entire thing boils down to. Whatever happened to the campaign promises Biden made, such as eliminating student loan debt, such as decriminalizing marijuana, such as a right to unions? What happened to the PRO Act? Such as building back better? Why is the federal minimum wage still not a living wage? Why are people still living in poverty? All these problems that are occurring domestically, people are getting slapped upside the head with an inflation, but they want us to focus on the Ukraine, on Russia, on the border, the Chinese, everything else but the problems that affect us immediately and most close up at home. I mean, my heart really does bleed, truly. Believe me when I say what's going on in Ukraine is terrible and it should stop quick, fast, and in a hurry. But trying to divert everyone's attention to a situation that in the grand scheme of things, when it boils down to it, won't affect them nowhere near as much as rent is going up in this country, just doesn't, it rubs me the wrong way. It truly does. But anyway, I've been rambling for long enough. That was a video from Noam Chomsky. I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and it shed some much needed light on this entire situation.